Hey guys, this is Lucas from Better Coding Academy, and in this video I'm bringing back a code review. This time I've got this shopping list kind of project over here. It's just a very simple JavaScript project, but it's currently broken and it has a few design issues. I'm going to run you through just how I look at it and what I'm thinking, and also how we can fix this thing up. So the idea is that it's a shopping list you can type into. So like maybe it might be, might need some bread, for example, and you can press enter normally to add this in, but currently nothing is working. So we're going to have a look and see why. So if you look over here in the source code, we've got 3 files, but I guess 2 main files here. One of them is index.html, which has our shopping list, the HTML here, and the index.js file, and this one here is like the backbone of the operation. So we'll also have a style.scss, but we're not going to worry about that for the time being. We're just going to look at index.html and index.js. So specifically here, index.html, you'll notice here actually is that it's not even connected to index.js, which might explain why this isn't working. But in any case, let's kind of have a look in the console and see what's going on here. So if we just do that, you see we get handle key down is not defined. So index.html here is looking for handle key down, and this one I assume can be found here. Yep, there we go. So basically this is the same method across both, and this design here basically says we're expecting this event handler to exist globally, which would make sense that this file basically requires this one in order to work, but in this case here we haven't included it. So I'm just going to go down here and just do script src is equal to index.js like that. I like to do /. It's just a thing from node.js, but you don't have to. You can just do that as well. Either way, it will work just fine. So I've actually got parcel running over here, so that will automatically compile that for me. So let's see now if it's working. Let's try to buy some bread. Okay, and let's do apples and tuna. And let's just say we get rid of apples and get rid of bread. Get rid of tuna. Okay, great. So all of that seems to be working, and it seems to be fully functional, because obviously it's not a very large project, but there are still quite a few issues here that I want to go over and I want to run through with you. So the first thing we're going to talk about here is line 17. Now on line 17 here, we do on key down equals handle key down event. Now this is a really big problem. The reason for that is because our HTML is binding to our JavaScript. In other words, our HTML is like the master here, and the JavaScript needs to provide certain things in order to get the HTML working. But in fact, the relationship should be the other way around, in that your JavaScript code should be the master and the HTML should kind of support it here. You'll notice here that we do on key down equals handle key down event. This basically says to JavaScript, okay, I expect you to give me a global method. Remember, it has to be global in order to be accessible inside of HTML. A global handle key down function here, which I'm going to use in order to handle my key down events. So basically it's saying to JavaScript, you have to behave this way. Now that's really bad because, well, in one case here, this is working just fine. But in some cases, say for example, if you're using Webpack, these methods here, when you write function handle key down, it doesn't automatically get added into the global scope. You see what we're doing here is actually, it's the same thing for parcel. So this line here, window.handle key down equals handle key down, is absolutely necessary, because if we don't write this line, this function actually isn't even global. So you see now here, if we try this, it's actually broken. And that's because parcel automatically wraps it. And we can confirm that by having a look at this one here. And if we do a search for handle key down, you see that it's here, but it's inside another function, which is wrapped in like a whole bunch of other code and whatnot. So basically parcel says, hey, I'm going to wrap this and I'm going to do stuff with it. So you have to actually explicitly make it global. And this just makes it even worse. So let's go over how I would actually do this here. Firstly, what I would do is I would get rid of this line here. I'd probably also get rid of this on key down and just have item input there like that. And with the item input, I'd actually get rid of the handle key down function. And instead, I'm going to do directly document.getElement by ID. And I'm going to select this item input, which has an ID here conveniently. And I'm going to do .add event listener key down, and I'm going to specify this as the function handler for that. So we have our handler here like so, which just adds in key down and it does the same thing. However, you'll notice that this has a big paradigm shift. Now what we're doing is our JavaScript is hooking into our HTML. The JavaScript can be thought of as the master here, and that's really important because the JavaScript code should be the foundation of your application, not the actual HTML code. So especially when you have, say for example, one HTML file, you might have 4 or 5 different JavaScript files included on your page. And in such a situation, you might have multiple handle key down global functions, which can obviously cause certain issues with clashes and all that kind of stuff. But on the other hand, it also makes debugging really hard because you don't know where handle key down comes from, and you don't know which other HTML files might depend upon it. So it's always better to have JavaScript as the source of truth as opposed to HTML. So this is how I'd fix that issue. Let's just check and make sure that it's still working. Seems fine to me so far. Let's just do a click. Yep, seems fine so far. So now let's look at the second issue I've identified here. And specifically, that issue is with the use of the this. So you'll notice here what we're doing is we have this underscore this, which then becomes let item equals this.value, whatever that is doing here. And it seems like the reason I guess we needed this is because back then we had the on key down. So this would pass in event, but it wouldn't bind it to the actual input. But what we can actually do now is because we have this bound directly to the input here as an add event listener, we can actually get rid of this underscore this monstrosity. And then instead of writing underscore this, we can just write the actual word this, which in turn refers to this input. So after you do that, this should actually still be working correctly. So A, B, C, D, and we should still be able to remove that. So that's the other issue I identified here. And now let's have a look at no items EL. So specifically, you'll notice that it says no items add one below when we first load the page. And then once we add in a few things and then we get rid of them, it shows no items add one below as well. However, I want to show you something, which is if we go here to no items add one below, and let's just change the syntax. Let's just say, put something at the end. Let's write foo, for example. You'll see that says foo here, but then if we add in something and get rid of that, you see it still says no items add one below. And the reason for that is because this is actually hard coded into the JavaScript. And we'll look at index.js here, and you'll see that it says on line 8 here, it says no items add one below for the no items element. Now this is not good because this essentially means two sources of truth. So where does this text come from? Well, it also comes from line 8 and it also comes from line 11 here. So having two sources of truth is always a bad idea because when you change one of them and say, for example, forget to change the other, then you have issues and it might cause, in some cases, just a minor textual difference. But in some cases, it can cause something which breaks your application. So what we're going to do is have no items add one below here. And what I'm actually going to do is actually kind of smart, but we're going to go here and I'm going to write const no items el equals document.get element by ID, no items like that. So you see also here on line 22 is we're doing document.query selector hash no items. Generally, if you're selecting an element by ID, just use get element by ID because it's a bit faster and it's pretty much the same syntax, so it's not like super verbose or anything. So anyways, we'll use no items el there and we'll write it up here. And what we're going to do is actually get rid of these two lines here and also get rid of that. So we're going to remove it regardless of whether there are existing elements. We're always going to remove it. And then inside of here, instead of creating it, we're going to get rid of these three lines and just directly append child no items el. Now this might be kind of confusing, but what happens is on this line here, when we add in a new element, we remove no items el. And if it's been removed, it's not going to do anything. But the thing is, even though it's been removed, it's still stored in memory here inside no items el. So with this here, what we can then do is add it back in later on using shopping list el.append child no items el. So we basically just remove it from the DOM and then later on we add it back into the DOM. So now with that there, let's try this again, A, B, C, and if we were to remove them, then we have this one back here. If we were to write, say for example, bar here, let's do something else this time. A, B, C, and then let's remove that and you see it still says bar. So now we have one source of truth, which is infinitely better than two sources of truth. Okay, so now the next thing we're going to have a look at is this part here. So we do let item equals this dot value. This one here, item, is actually only being used on this line here. And what we're going to do for that is we're going to use const because we're not changing it. Now, some people prefer to use let and they don't like the way that JavaScript uses const and they only like to use const for actual legitimate constants. If you're one of those people, please don't criticize me in the comments. I totally understand your position. But what you'll notice here is that for the majority of our application, we're actually using const here. So we're doing const shopping list el, const no items el, const item el, blah, 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 and so on. And these are for values that we don't intend to change. So we're going to do the same thing here for the item because we don't intend to change it. So the main thing to take away here is consistency. So we're going to use const there, make sure everything's still working fine. In a production grade application, you'd usually have tests in order to make sure that it is in fact still working fine. But for this case here, I think it's sufficient to just have it eyeball it and just test its basic functionality. So now the next thing here I've noticed is that if we go into Google Chrome here, and let's just put in, say, a space and press enter, you'll notice that it actually adds that as a valid element. And the reason for that is because we check this .value, and if it's equal to an empty string we return, which basically prevents us from pressing enter straight away. However, if the value is purely consisting of white space, it still allows us to add that in. So that's a problem, and a simple solution is just to trim the value. So that way, even if you have a bunch of spaces, you can't press enter and submit that. So this is something you can use as you wish. Just one note is that don't use this kind of stuff with passwords. I've seen it happen before in the past. Some people can put spaces at the beginning and the end of their passwords, and that shouldn't be something you should limit. So just don't do that with passwords. With other things, you can kind of generally see if it works well or not, but usually it works pretty well. So that's one more thing I noticed. And the final thing to note here is this one up here. So you see we do get elements by class name shopping list 0, which means we grab the first shopping list here on the page. Now, this is not a strictly enforced rule, but it's considered by many JavaScript programmers to be best practice to not use classes for selection inside of JavaScript. So there's this term we use called hooks, and it has nothing to do with React hooks or anything like that, but it's basically just how our JavaScript hooks onto our HTML and kind of does changes. So generally, there are two ways that we usually do hooks. The first way is using IDs, and the second way is using custom data attributes. So a data attribute will look something like this, something equals value. So that is another way that we can do it. But one way that is generally frowned upon is the use of class. So styling is generally reserved for CSS code, and generally what you actually do is not use IDs in CSS, purely use it for JavaScript, and then purely use classes inside of CSS. So that's just the standard that a lot of JavaScript programmers go by, and that's something I'm going to be enforcing here today, also for the sake of simplicity. So you notice here for our input as well is we have class equals input, ID equals item input, and then we use item input here in the JavaScript, and we only use .input in the CSS. It just really helps to create reusability in CSS and also specificity inside of JavaScript. So now here for our shopping list, it's a really simple change. Just change that to an ID, and then over here we're going to change this one to use the ID here as well. So now let's just save that and make sure it's still working. A, B, C, D. And it seems to be working just fine. So this was just a quick code review video in which I went over some best practices and also fixing up some common mistakes that JavaScript programmers make. Hope you enjoyed this video. This has been Lucas with Better Coding Academy, and see you guys later.